interested, the link is to the Cineculture program, and Cineculture will be hosting it, and we're going to have, I think, at least one of the directors here to discuss it after the film. So this is always a fun event because it's got 6 really interesting films. You can follow us always on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on a website, and if you don't get our email blast, you can contact me. I'll put you on our email blast so that you know about our upcoming events. Then I just want to talk about a couple more. So another new book, The United States. Well, we went a little too far. Well, no, actually we're right there. It's cut off a little bit. But it's Dr. Julian Zarifian is coming from, well, I have it on automatic, but I shouldn't probably. But he's coming from all the way from France, but he's written a book on the United States and the Armenian genocide. We're going to have that on a Monday night right here. Monday night right here. Okay, so that's coming up. And then following that will be Dr. Taline Sujan's second lecture. And that's going to be back in her venue where we had it at the Smith Camp Alumni House. So we just have to keep track of where we're moving. And if you're not sure, call us or just look and we'll tell you about it. And this is the second in her series of lectures. And remember, the first was about letters. This one's going to be about postcards. So she's going to talk about Armenian postcards which were produced in Turkey. And the lecture will be about that. And then we're going to have a book talk. Another one by David Karamian, who's written a really wonderful sort of travel log called The Lone Stone, A Traveler's Guide to Tradition and Modernity, and that would be back in this building. So that we have a lot of events coming, and that's not all of them. So these are just some of them. And then on March 16th, we have our 37th annual banquet. If anyone's interested in attending, just see me about it. This is really, for our program, this is our sort of big event because we highlight our graduating seniors that are getting a minor in Armenian Studies. We're awarding more than 50 scholarships, over $100,000 in scholarships awarded by our program to students who are taking Armenian Studies courses. So it's really, I don't think any other program in the United States or anywhere really gives that much in that. Okay, so let me switch over to the PowerPoint and then I'll introduce our guests. So good evening once again, and all of you know me. I'm Professor Barlo Dermagradich of the Armenian Studies program, and I'd like to welcome you to our spring lecture series. This is our second presentation, and tonight's lecture is co-sponsored through the Florence Hamperson Fund for Armenian Studies. And those of you that are not familiar with this fund, about, I think it's now 3 years ago, Florence Hamperson left in her will to the Armenian Studies program $450. Which is now in an endowment, and then we use that for our programs, our activities, and so we use it to help support these kinds of programs. So we're very thankful to her family for making that donation. Tonight we're here to talk about, yes?
It's Elaine Hamperson.
Florence Elaine Hamperson, actually. I didn't say the full, yeah. Florence Elaine Hamperson, they're from Pilgrim Church, right? Yes. Yeah. Dr. Talar Chahinian is our guest. Tonight she's be talking about her research on her new book, which has just been published, called Stateless, The Politics of the Armenian Language in Exile. And it focuses on some key moments in the placing of Western Armenian literary history. So the focus will be on the Western Armenian language and how it developed in post-World War I Paris and post-World War II Beirut. I'm not going to say anything else because that's the topic that she'll be presenting. And she is a graduate of UCLA with a doctorate in comparative literature. And today she's she's a lecturer in the Armenian Studies program at the University of California, Irvine, where Huri Berberian is the director of the program. And Talar is working, how many years has it been now, Talar? 7th year that she's been working. She teaches Western Armenian, and she can tell you maybe a little bit about that because it's interesting that the language is still being taught there as well as here. She is also on visiting faculty at Irvine in the Department of Comparative Literature. As I mentioned, she's the author of the new book that we're looking at, but she's also the co-editor with Dr. Tsolin Nalbantian and Sosi Kasparian of a book which is called The Armenian Diaspora and Stateless Power, Collective Identity in the Transnational 20th Century. This was a book which was published based on a conference that the Society for Armenian Studies held. And I'm the current president of the Society for Armenian Studies, so now we're going to move forward with a lot of new things as well. She also co-edits a magazine called Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies. So I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Talar Chahinian. Dr. Chahinian?
Hello, good evening, Faribun. Thank you so much, Barlow. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and talk to you about my book. I just want to say a thank you to Barlow for this invitation. This is my first time presenting to the Armenian Studies, or kind of visiting the Armenian Studies program here in Fresno. I follow its activities for many years from afar through the newspaper that arrives in my mail. And I also have to say a few words about Barlow and his support in general, and just sort of his figure in the world of Armenian studies, that I have done my graduate, postgraduate work. He's been sort of a very active and leading figure in the Society for Armenian Studies scene and tangential scene. And my book just won an award by the Society of Armenian Studies that has been made possible by Barlow. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for this invitation. So my book, Stateless, and the longer title you see up here, The Politics of the Armenian Language in Exile, focuses on two key moments and places of Western Armenian literary history. One, post-World War I Paris, and two, post-World War I Beirut, to examine how a stateless language sustained itself in a diasporic setting. In it, by analyzing the public debates, critical writings, and the creative works of writers gathered around the journal Menk, and writers gather around the Writers Association of Syria and Lebanon, what I'll be referring to as WASL. I comparatively interrogate competing models of literary production and their intersection with Western Armenians' prolonged linguistic vitality. Let me get oriented with my slide switching here. All right. To give you an overview today of the project, I'd like to work backward and draw your attention to key moments closer to our time that inform this book's retrospective line of inquiry. In contemporary Armenian studies scholarship, any examination of the post-genocide diasporic experience is inevitably filtered through the major shift that reorganized the Armenian world in 1991, that of the establishment of the Republic of Armenia. While we often focus on the geopolitical implications of independence, we seldom reflect on its cultural impact. How do we think of Armenian culture, literature, and language differently since 1991? What is the politics of language that emerges as a result of Eastern Armenian being sanctioned by a state? In this new reality, what happens to the status and future of Western Armenian, an exilic post-genocide linguistic form? How does the existence of a nation-state challenge the more transnational concept of a literary center that was cultivated in the diaspora regarding linguistic and literary production, publication, and circulation? These questions are not the object of study in my book, but they inform the lens through which I examine processes of forging literary belonging in an exilic language in the absence of state institutions. The other lens that filters my examination of Western Armenian language in the post-genocide years is its current status as an endangered language and the sense of alarm and activism that accompanies it. In 2010, based on research submission made by a couple of Armenian studies scholars, UNESCO qualified Western Armenian as definitely endangered. This is something I imagine all of you in this room are aware of. And particularly in those years that followed 2010 and this declaration immediately, there was quite a buzz in a lot of Armenian diaspora communities, and maybe a sense of alarm that came with it immediately. So just to kind of take a quick look, in its 6-scale categorization, Western Armenian is situated here based on the research presented to UNESCO as definitely endangered, and the spectrum, of course, goes from safe toward extinct. And this categorization, particularly the category that Western Armenian received, implies that children no longer learn the language as a mother tongue in the home. And this is not an absolute statement, but it's sort of signaling to the decline in numbers, the rapid decline in numbers of children learning this language, their mother tongue, which gets this categorization. So on the one hand, this of course compels us to ask, how did we get here? And very often there's a sort of a lament and fatigue and sort of how did we get here, where were we and where are we now kind of thing that frames these discussions, right? When this was sort of publicized at the beginning, even because the alarm was so big and wide, some people even sort of criticized, why now? This has been going on only when an non-Armenian organization is raising alarm and the flag. We are all of a sudden turning our attention to Western Armenian, while there are teachers and scholars on the ground who have been sort of trying to say the same thing all along. So there's quite a lot of buzz on this front of the question of how did we get here? On the other hand, as my book suggests, if we leave that lament framework, this gives us an opportunity to dismantle the unequivocal relationship we assume with the West Armenian standard and surviving Armenians, and to probe how Western Armenian, in its Istanbul variant, became the language of the surviving dispersed population, which many scholars and historians have discussed was a linguistically heterogeneous group, speaking of multiple regional dialects, speaking Turkish, and more specifically, how it became the language and political tool, as I will argue, that fashioned what we would conceive as dispersion into diaspora. In this book, I look back at Western Armenians' presence in the print world to think about how the political violent origins of dispersion affected the aesthetic development of literature and the ideological framing of language. In other words, I'm looking at Western Armenian at the intersection of trauma and transnationalism to suggest that whereas in the years following World War I, the Paris-based writers imagined the new Western Armenian literary world as consisting of a pluralistic transnational network of communities, the post-World War II writers gathered in the Middle East adopted a relatively homogeneous national model of literary production centralized in Beirut. Their contrasting discursive approaches reflected in community-wide processes of naming both the genocide and the diaspora. So if we think back and look back at the way Armenian thinkers, intellectuals, community leaders have left traces of their discussion about the genocide as a historic event, as a catastrophe, in the early years, in the post-World War I years, prior to the term solidifying itself as genocide, we see a variety of terminology that refer to the experience of catastrophe, from massacre to yeren, to crime, to deportation and catastrophe. And this is something that has been written about by a number of scholars, and most recently there's a great book by Vartan Matosyan that talks about the politics of naming the genocide itself. So I want you guys sort of to follow along with my argument. Think about this move from the vast terminology that came to express, or that was used to express something that was that sort of language where language would fail in expressing, right? We have a plurality of terms that is trying to arrive at this unexplainable catastrophe. And then we have then the solidification of that event into this one neat term, the genocide. And I want you to sort of follow along with me and think about what happens similarly to diaspora, becoming a fixed term, just as genocide did, to describe the communities in dispersion after World War II. So the compound word spurashchar, diaspora world, appeared in the French Armenian press as early as 1926. While there were a few appearances of spurk, diaspora, neither spurashchar, the compound word, nor spurk gained currency and circulation in Armenian periodicals until after World War II. So what you're seeing in the back there, High Spurk, is a rare appearance of this term that we throw around all the time now, right? Spurk, diaspora. You see High Spurk there, it's sort of calling for a survey of various communities to kind of locate the Armenian population within their region, identify them by profession, where they're from, and things like that. It's a survey. And we see it appearing here in 1933 in a journal of the Union of Adult Orphans called Chunk in Paris. And it's a very rare appearance. At this time, instead of what we know now as spurk, the terminology with which the Armenian dispersed masses are being referred to in print culture are Tırkahaytun, Turkish Armenians, Sırvazuchun, dispersion, Kahutahaytun, community Armenians, Kahut referring literally to the concept of colony, Kahaytun, migrant Armenians, Ardasahmani Haytun, Armenians abroad, Kahtashkhat, migrant world, and so on. If we look at some of the central nodes where Armenian print culture flourished after the genocide, like Boston, Paris, Aleppo, Beirut, Jerusalem, Cairo, we see the dispersed masses being referred to, like I said, in this range of descriptive terms. By the mid-1940s, however, spurk, diaspora, gained traction as the word of choice to describe the dispersed community of Armenians, slowly pushing alternative phrases out of use. These intersecting paradigms of belonging and identification, one to communities of dispersion and the other to diaspora communities, engendered opposing transnational and national imaginings of literature, which in turn created a clash between the language's natural development in relation to each host state's linguistic policies on one hand, and an insistence on orienting language toward a homeland, whether mythically or territorially bound, on the other. In their language standardization efforts, intellectuals and writers in the Middle East positioned Western Armenian against Soviet Armenian, claiming that the Soviet Union's imperial aims threatened the Armenian national identity and language. As they developed a national rubric for language and literature in exile, Western Armenian writers and educators believed themselves to be preserving the Armenian language's integrity against the Soviet Empire's colonizing force, with the aim of an eventual return to the historic unified homeland. This national rubric, practiced as a form of diasporic transnationalism, became known as Hayetsi, which loosely translates to Armenian-oriented, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in just a few moments. The Hayetsi rubric measured the literariness of works through its evocation of the Armenian spirit, whether through a narrativization of the past, a lamentation of victimhood, or a celebration of resistance. Its restrictive demands on Western Armenian literature helped solidify the dispersed communities as a single unit known as the Armenian diaspora. I argue that its homogenizing drive, while creating a vital Armenian literary apparatus in the Middle East, ultimately overpowered the pluralistic drive of statelessness and proved counterproductive to Western Armenian survival in the face of the diaspora's changing circumstances, like the transition to an independent state and the changes that followed. So I'd like to take a moment and briefly discuss the competing models that I've been alluding to. One in the post-World War I years based in Paris, and two post-World War II years based in Beirut, as propagated by one, and I'm kind of zooming in to the writers around, gathered around the Menk, and the writers gathered around Wassel. On one hand, we have a model that grounds its narratives in, if we look at this side, in the host nation's local, and it uses Western Armenian, the language, as a medium for representing the experience of exile. In the process, it expands and cultivates the language's expressive quality. On the other hand, we have a model that evades the local, the host nation's local, and rather grounds itself in the language. So what does this mean? How does this work out when we're thinking about the production of literature outside of a territory or outside of a named state or any kind of national framing in that sense, in diaspora settings? So for Menk writers, and this is something that they've written about as well in their journal, in newspapers, trying to kind of defend their platform. So one, they are committed to producing contemporaneous writing. They're writing about their now. Their protagonists are semi-autobiographical figures, sort of reflecting their own experience, based in Paris. The streets that the characters are walking on are in Paris or Marseille. It's in very much grounded and rooted in the local of the host state, and it is in their now. As they conceptualize themselves in a literary tradition, they see themselves as sort of one-off, broken off from the past, trying to create a distance between themselves and the writers that came prior to 1915, and sort of almost antagonistic toward the earlier Western Armenian literary tradition that was centralized in then Constantinople. Sort of break from tradition, that this is unlike anything we've experienced before, and this cannot belong to, we cannot assume that there's a seamlessness that of what was and what is now. They see the catastrophe that befell on them as something that has ultimately severed the possibility of continuity. And they emphasize prose writing. Some of them are writing poetry, even in their journal, but as a platform, they want to cultivate prose writing. The novel, they say, is underdeveloped in Western Armenian. We need to cultivate it. And here, the commitment is to be producing works in Western Armenian. So language is a tool to do all of these things, to achieve all of these things. The way they see themselves as part of other dispersed Armenian writers around the world is through what I refer to as decentered transnationalism in dispersion. So the emphasis here is not on a single diaspora unit, but a dispersed unit, each different in its sort of each community different in its character and relationship to their own local. On the other hand, what we see happening, sort of, or the platform we see being developed by Wassel post-World War II is, I mean, I've reduced things, simplified things here, and in the book I open this up so much more, but the writing focuses on the past, what was lost, a celebration of what was lost, nostalgic remembrance of what was lost, or the past suffering. So the past is a lot more central than there now. They're rather than sort of using the low integrated model, they cultivate what they call the Hayetsi model of literary production, Hayetsi Kıragançun. And any of you in here who have gone through Armenian day schools in the diaspora, pretty much anywhere, are familiar with the kinds of textbook that came out of this move that educated many generations in the Hayetsi model. They see themselves as the connecting thread to the pre-1915 tradition and writers. So they kind of jump over the Paris scene. And rather than prose, their emphasis is on poetry. They produce anthologies, collections of poetries. Poetry, of course, also can be recited. It's circulated orally, not only in print. And what I refer to their model as centered nationalism in diaspora. So dispersion kind of diaspora is the framework I'm using to analyze these two scenes and these competing models. I'm not going to go over too much about, I'm not going to focus too much on the theoretical framing of the book. Only very quickly to say that for today's talk, I'll be focusing a little bit on the idea of stateless power, which I'd like to explain and reference Khachik Talilyan's discussion of it, to then kind of arrive at why I'm referring to Western Armenian as a stateless language. And a part of the book, which I don't have time to go over today, is also reading particularly the Menk literature and their novels and novellas and short stories through the idea of indexical representation, an approach to trauma, reading trauma in literature, or to reading literature of catastrophe, wherein the basic understanding is, or I adopt the understanding, the psychoanalytic understanding of trauma as something that is a wound that is only relived, or actually lived and felt for the first time belatedly in its aftermath in a different context. So the idea is the understanding of trauma that it is, upon experiencing, it is traumatic insofar as it cannot be associated into conscious thought, and therefore appears at a later time in a later place. So the theory of belatedness is something that informs my readings of the Menk group literature, which on first reading you feel like, why are they not, they're all orphans, why are they not writing about the genocide? And I think as Armenians we go into literature with that lens, particularly if we were looking at literature produced in 1920s, 1930s by people who who survived, who experienced, who witnessed, and yet there is this absence of it on the surface. Of course, it's very much there, just not the kind of narratives we're used to, the visualizations we're used to seeing. And I'll focus a little bit more on the other side. While Eastern Armenian is the de facto official language of the Republic of Armenia, some scholars contend that legally the state does not exclude Western Armenian from its constitution, which, based on a 1993 language law, uses the umbrella term Armenian language, without mentioning its Eastern or Western standards. Article 1 of the language law calls for the preservation of the Armenian language, both in the Republic and within Armenian populations outside its borders, and for unification of orthography. Anahid Donabedian, the linguist based in Paris, sees the extension of language unification efforts outside of the Republic as an attempt to consolidate its Eastern-speaking diaspora through the production of material sources. So if we think of, for instance, mean, what she's talking about can be placed on a very concrete example. If we think, for instance, I'm coming from LA, the public school system there in Glendale has a FLAC program. It offers a dual immersion Armenian program. So some schools do offer their teachings for those students who are signed up and registered for that program. They can take, they can be receiving their education 70% in Armenian for the first half and 30% in English. And the second half of the year, it'll switch to the percentage will switch. It'll be 70% English, 30% Armenian. It's an adoption of the immersion model, and it has this FLAC program exists for multiple languages, and Armenian is included in it. But being a sort of a state program here, and thinking about the teachers it needs to hire for it to function, the actual material, textbooks, and curricula that it needs to function, it is associated with the Republic of Armenia. So the in-material sort of curriculum that it serves population is in Eastern Armenian, in Reformed orthography, things that are coming from Armenia. This is sort of what Dona Bedian is talking about. The sort of, even though there is no mention of Eastern, Western, there's no differentiation on the part of the Constitution, but this is how states function, and through these material sources, the diaspora communities are also then affected in this of, if we're looking at it from the perspective of Western Armenian. Recognizing Western Armenian as factually stateless, Hagop Gulujian, who teaches Western Armenian at UCLA, argues that our insistence on using the separate Eastern-Western designations creates a hierarchy which enables, by the ambiguity of Armenia's constitution, which enabled by the ambiguity of Armenia's constitution, lead to the demotion of the Western standard. So to avoid this demotion, he argues, Western Armenian should equally refer to itself as the whole, as simply Armenian. Yet it's hard to ignore the decades of strategic fashioning Western Armenian underwent in order to precisely call itself that, Eastern Armenian's other. The politics of language that occasioned the turn from dispersion to diaspora holds at its core the tension between flexibility and flexible and prohibitive power that plays out in exiled communities. This is what Khajik Talilian, a prolific theorist of diaspora, has called stateless power. His scholarship over the last several decades has contributed to centralizing the diaspora experience so that it's not simply seen as a subsidiary ideas of homeland host state. In asking us to imagine diaspora as an alternative to the nation state, he calls our attention to diasporic communities' potential to be sedentary, but have built-in forms of governance that could engender emancipatory possibilities on one hand, as well as place restrictive demands on its members. Part of what fueled the emphasis on language and literature as a marker of national identity within this exercise of power, or the campaign of nation preservation, was the growing rift between the two standards, owing to the progress the latter linguistic form was making in Soviet Armenia. As part of its program for a cultural revolution, Soviet Armenia officially proclaimed Armenian its state language and began to build its cultural infrastructure, which consisted of establishing national library, museum, theater, university, and so on. And as we know, in 1921, the decree to eradicate literacy, sort of under that flag, the orthographic reforms that followed. As Eastern Armenian benefited from state sponsorship and built a mechanism of production, publication, circulation, anti-Soviet intellectuals in the diaspora began to question the motives of Soviet authorities and argued that the language reforms were part of an orchestrated campaign to further separate Soviet Armenians from Armenians in dispersion. The politicization of the language debate reached a turning point immediately after World War II, when in the midst of the repatriation campaign, Middle Eastern Armenian intellectuals began to write explicitly against Soviet Armenia, criticizing its refusal to recognize the validity of Western Armenian as part of the greater Armenian culture. In 1948, an article in Boston's Hayrenik Monthly referred to the Armenian community in the United States as the most, I'm going to say the Armenian word, unbust, disadvantageous community, arguing that in the absence of Armenian day schools, there were no prospects for language maintenance there. Therefore, assessing the Middle East communities as far more favorable spaces, political parties there worked toward constructing cultural and educational structures that sought to preserve the language. These newfound educational institutions made a concerted effort to standardize and revivify the Western Armenian linguistic form. In addition to standardization efforts in Armenian day schools, a political campaign designed to prohibit the use of Turkish in colloquial speech within the refugee population was adopted by community organizations. Ultimately, both endeavors forged a linguistically homogeneous group out of a culturally diverse population. I'm going to move to this. In 1946, the Soviet Armenian Writers Union's Second Congress served as a catalyst in the making of this competitive discourse and corresponding campaigns. There were 9 invitees out of, this is the first time, well, this was the Second Congress of the Writers Union, and it was the first time that diaspora writers were being invited to participate, and there were 9 diaspora writers selected and invited to go. While the controversy might appear to mirror political alignments and ideological arguments, here there was quite an outrage after these invitations, and it was really split along party lines. Those pro-Soviet publications were applauding this move of invitation, and anti-Soviet publications were heavily criticizing and going as far as even sort of making derogatory comments at the 9 authors that were invited, calling them second-rate, etc., etc. So quite a lot of controversy. But the central debate that emerges during this time is a very heated debate that is transnational, and you can see almost every newspaper addressing this at that time during the months months leading up to it and the months following. Is the debate that emerged from this is about the fate of the Western Armenian linguistic form. While the diaspora invitees were allocated 15 minutes each to present their views on Armenian literature of their regions, it was Yerevan native Edward Topçan's report that served as the official stance of the Writers' Union on diaspora literature. And in it, denying the diaspora any possibility for artistic creation in exile, this is what his report said at the time. Over the last 30 years, the Armenian people who were uprooted from their fatherland passed through the roads of suffering and bore countless grievances and deprivation. Artistic literature shared the people's fate, bearing the deadly stamp of alienation. It then presents a number of French, Armenian, and Armenian-American writers within the framework of assimilation's threat, and criticizes others, such as Levon Shant, Hagop Oshagan, and Hamastel, for their nationalistic approach of looking backward at history rather than forward to the future as inspirations for their writing. Topçan concludes his report by recommending that diaspora literature consider nurturing the concept of return and the building of a socialist homeland as its sole trajectory. Otherwise, he sees only decline and death in its future, a verdict that he is not reluctant to express openly, as he says, this literature, which is detached from its homeland and its people, has no prospect for development. True art can flourish only if it is intimately fused with its motherland and its people. We can imagine diaspora writers who are dispersed and press against all odds feel like they are contributing to something, being quite outraged at this verdict being sounded out from Armenia. And of course, political alignments fuel the stance that and the interpretation that the writers were making vis-a-vis these statements that were coming out of the 1946 Congress. Periodicals sympathetic to the ARF responded in outrage to this 1946 Congress's stamping of Western Armenian literature with an expiration date, and published articles calling for the need for language revitalization, which eventually spread across party lines. Arshak Chobanian, for instance, from France, raised alarm about discussions of assimilating Western Armenian into the Eastern Standard and offered a striking defense of maintaining and cultivating both linguistic forms, which he referred to, in his article, he refers to as cultural treasures, both of them, and the classical orthography. Subsequently, the enormity of the language maintenance task highlighted the need for organizations networked across diaspora communities. Under this rubric, Aleppo-based journal Naidi's editorial team initiated an effort to form an organized collective of diaspora intellectuals by proposing the establishment of a writers' association that was based in the Middle East. A writers' union that links together writers of the diaspora from various communities, a well-established publishing house, an illuminous center. So we see for the first time this public announcement calling for centralization, and particularly centralizing efforts in the Middle East at this point. In the months that followed, the journal published echoes in support of this idea of a union of writers, sort of against the Soviet Armenian Writers Union. Ultimately, though, falling short of their desired transnational scope, they announced the founding of the Writers Union of Syria and Lebanon in 1947. Claiming that the 1946 Soviet Armenian Writers' Congress was nothing more than, and I quote, an assassination effort targeted toward the literature of exiled communities, end quote, the association began thinking about a reactionary conference and publicly started brainstorming the agenda. This is just a quote from Seza and Nairi talking about the importance of this kind of centering of writers, gathering of writers, and they start publishing questionnaires and things like that to kind of start the discussion publicly of what types of agenda items centered around language that a conference like this should take on. And this is just sort of one example that falls within the debate during this time. It's about orthography, sort of the hybrid, an emergence of a hybrid language, and so on. And at first, they basically put this idea out. We need a conference, but we don't have the resources and means to actually put it together. An organization should take it on. Maybe Hamaskayin should take it on. Maybe any organization take it on. And ultimately, they end up with the work. And again, the transnational scope that they had imagined becomes really limited to the Middle East and writers that are affiliated within their own internal network. These discussions culminated in 1948 conference held in Shtora, Lebanon, with the aim of consolidating Western Armenian literary identity and coining it explicitly as diaspora literature. And this is where we see Spuk come to the forefront. What I started with in my earlier slides of the terminology, the plural terminology, now it very intentionally and consistently spuk, and in this case it's the realm of literature and language that is beginning to cultivate that narrative of a unit called spuk. So if we take a look at the program from the 48 conference, and I'm just going to read some of the titles to give you an idea of how spuk is coming up over and over again, and this is quite a drastic shift from everything that's being published before this moment in history. So Artsaga Sputki, Armenian prose in the diaspora, Armenian drama in the diaspora, diaspora Armenian press. This is issues concerning the Armenian language, poetry in the diaspora, diasporan literature's trajectories, and of course, if the Soviet Armenian Congress had someone give a report on diaspora literature, and there the spuk is not being used by Topjian from Yerevan. There it's Arda Sahmani Kraganchun abroad. So the spuk branding is very much happening in the Middle East. Soviet Armenian literature by Anton Zarugian, sort of to do the flip. We speak for you if you speak for us, sort of thing. And so through this, they're talking about, for instance, young Vahe Oshagan, who's participating in this, is talking about a traveling theater troupe. Centralized diaspora troupe that would go from community and stage plays. Boyajian is talking about an actual network of diaspora writers that this organization would facilitate. Talilian is talking about establishment of a big publishing house that would then manage the circulation of diaspora literature across communities. Daronian is talking about the need to start printing, developing Armenian language textbooks that could then standardize education across diaspora communities. They're talking about the forging of a reading public for this thing that they are about to serve called diaspora literature. While the stamping is happening in almost every one of these reports and the notes that are then being printed from this meeting, the definition is a little elusive. This is what we get. That which we term diaspora literature is the continuation of Western Armenian literature. We call diaspora literature works that have been informed by our dispersion. So there's two conditions only at this point that are being met in the actual articulation of its definition. One, that we are going to be the connecting thread. We're going to jump back to pre-1915 and serve as that connecting thread. There's continuity. We belong to a tradition. Two, that the content of this literature is going to be bound by our experience of displacement, our experience of exile and dispersion. And that part is what ultimately gets interpreted as the Hayetzi model. And so if we take a look at the some of the poems that qualify as Hayetzi, I just sort of put some segments of things that I discuss in the book. I devote a chapter looking through anthologies and textbooks that this particular group of writers produced that were then used in classrooms, and the various groupings, periodic groupings of Armenian literature. And this is just a few samplings to give you an idea, but I imagine, again, that a crowd like this who has attended commemoration events, Armenian gatherings, Armenian schools, any kind of Armenian diasporic gathering has at one point or another heard, maybe learned, maybe recited, maybe competed in recitals of a Hayetzi poem. where the content, the theme is almost self-reflexive, right? It's this Armenian-oriented celebration of symbols, looking at the past, framing, sort of approaching the Armenian existence experience through this notion of resistance and resilience, and etc. Rather than cultivating representations that emphasized the vernacular and the particular, educators, editors, and writers in Beirut forged a literary cosmopolitanism intended to universalize Armenian language and literary tradition in the diaspora. Ultimately, what they produced was national literature in exile, rather than transnational literature in dispersion, which is how I'm approaching the Menk writer's attempts. So even if it's framed as a form of resistance to the universalizing Soviet project, the nationalization of Western Armenia, in fact, replicated the hegemonizing structure of a state, regardless of the cultural diversity of its dispersed communities. At the conference, discussions about language preservation emphasized purification, cleansing, rather than development and dynamism. Many of the conference participants stressed the importance of keeping the literary language clean, free of regional or foreign influence. Minas Talilian, who is quite outspoken at the conference and the debates leading up to it, his presentation expands the argument to the Armenian use in the press, which he sees as particularly vulnerable site for Western Armenians' deterioration. He exclaims, "We need to fight," I quote, "we need to fight against linguistic barbarity with extreme meticulousness and to the point of being condemned." Talilian's case for ensuring Western Armenians' longevity serves a broader political agenda, which he is quick to relate. He says, "One day, if we gather in our fatherland, perhaps our languages will become one. The unrecognizable state of Soviet Armenian language forces us to care for our language, so that one day we may offer the necessary antidote." Really using the language badvast, vaccine, the antidote, framing Western Armenian as such, and arguing for its purified preservation for that eventual return. Here, Talilian reverses the critique of Western Armenian as a language incapable of sustaining itself in exile that was delivered in the 46th Congress. In fact, he presents Eastern Armenian of Soviet Armenia as endangered, substantiating the need for language preservation in the diaspora as a principled pan-national cause, albeit centered in the Middle East. So this is just a glimpse of the literary history that I trace in the book, and I focused a little bit more on the second moment, the Hayat model in that's developed by Wassel in the Middle East. But I want to end my talk with just a few comments and getting us to think about our current moment, which was my aim, and sort of this is where I started, because the project has it's a retrospective inquiry of, okay, this is where we are, these are the debates we're having about language now, how did all of this unravel, and how did we get here? Today, Western Armenian literature, inherently diasporic, finds itself in a transnational moment, needing to confront the porous boundaries of its sites of production. Its speakers and writers now live not only in the Middle Eastern communities, but in Armenia and hybrid communities like Los Angeles. These shifting communities worldwide have generated texts about displacement that imagine a layering of locales in their attempt to either reconstruct or represent the perpetually exilic path of their Armenian characters. Furthermore, in their new proximity to Eastern Armenian, these contemporary texts push language toward new linguistically hybrid and innovative territories. In contrast to the Hayatsi model, where the Armenian language performs as the location of the work, these multi-directional explorations of location and localization of Armenian narratives invite us to imagine an alignment of form and content, that is to say, the language's expressive quality and its literary output's representational authority. As Western Armenian literary production awaits possible new iterations, a retrospective glance at its story of becoming seems more relevant than ever. By juxtaposing the Menk generation's attempt to create a transnational literary space with Wassel's efforts to nationalize literature in exile, my book presents a theory of language vitality for stateless languages that is inextricably tied to a literary orientation grounded in dispersion rather than diaspora, and one which could prove effective in the current dynamics of the Armenian world. In examining how Western Armenians' literary orientation played out across many borders, I hope that my book also makes room for discussions about literatures that fall outside of the West's discursive dynamics of the global literary scene. While both camps' exclusion of the drive toward global circulation and international canonization leaves them out of discussions of world literary studies, they help us understand the critical inquiries into the intersection of trauma, nationalism, aesthetics, and politics that Western Armenian literature makes possible. Thank you for your attention.
Are you taking questions?
I think so, yes, we can
Yes,
take questions.
We are. So go ahead. Do you have questions? Go ahead.
Now, the Wassel approach would be, if you take in light of religion,